Daniel Wright didn't want to believe it. The thought had crept into his mind slowly at first, like a shadow in the corner of his vision. It was one of those things you tell yourself isn't real until you can't ignore it anymore. Little signs, small inconsistencies, things that were easy to dismiss on their own but harder to explain when they added up. It started with late nights. His wife, Vanessa, would come home later than usual, citing work deadlines or impromptu outings with friends. Daniel tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. She had a demanding career in event planning, and overtime was part of the job. But lately, the excuses had become too frequent, and her explanations were vague, almost rehearsed. The tension between them grew in subtle but unmistakable ways. She'd avoid eye contact during conversations, her answers curt and evasive. There was a coldness in her touch, a distance Daniel had never felt before. He couldn't pinpoint when things had changed, but he knew they had. Then there was the phone. Vanessa had always been private, but now her phone barely left her side. She'd smile at text messages and quickly turn the screen away when Daniel was nearby. Once, he caught her in the kitchen late at night, whispering into the phone. She ended the call abruptly when she noticed him watching, giving a nervous laugh and saying it was just a friend. A friend. Sure. That night, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling as doubt gnawed at him. Was he being paranoid? He didn't want to be the kind of man who jumped to conclusions, who saw betrayal where there was none. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He needed to know the truth. The next day, Daniel made a decision. He wasn't proud of it, but it felt necessary. He contacted a private investigator named Mark, a quiet, no-nonsense professional who specialized in discreet surveillance. I need to know if my wife is seeing someone, Daniel told him during their meeting at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. He felt a strange sense of shame even saying the words aloud. Can you help me? Mark nodded, his expression neutral. We can set up cameras and tracking systems, or I can follow her myself. It's up to you. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then said, both. I want cameras in the house and for you to tail her when she leaves. I don't want any gaps in the evidence. Mark scribbled notes on a pad. Understood. I'll get the equipment installed when she's out. It'll be discreet, nothing she'll notice. As they finalized the details, Daniel's mind raced. He hated that it had come to this. Surveillance, spying, these were things he had never imagined doing. But trust was fragile, and Vanessa had shattered his. If she was lying to him, he needed proof. Cold, undeniable proof. Over the next few days, the cameras were installed without incident. Small, motion-triggered devices were hidden in key locations around the house: the living room, the kitchen, the master bedroom. Mark also placed a GPS tracker on Vanessa's car and gave Daniel access to the surveillance feed through a secure app on his phone. Daniel felt a sickening mixture of anticipation and dread as he watched the feeds. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but each time Vanessa came home and moved through the house, he felt his pulse quicken. She acted normal enough, cooking dinner, watching TV, taking calls, but there was a tension in her movements that hadn't been there before. The first few nights yielded nothing significant. Vanessa's behavior, while distant, seemed innocent. Daniel began to wonder if he had made a mistake, if he had allowed paranoia to cloud his judgment. But just when he started to lower his guard, something changed. It happened on a Friday night. Vanessa had told him she was attending a networking event at a downtown hotel and wouldn't be home until late. Daniel pretended to accept her story, even offering to pick her up if she needed a ride. She declined, insisting she drive herself and probably stay the night at a friend's apartment nearby. As soon as she left, Daniel checked the GPS tracker. Vanessa's car was headed downtown as expected, but instead of stopping at the hotel, it diverted to a different location, a private residence in a wealthy part of the city. Daniel's hands tightened around his phone as he stared at the screen. Who lives there? He wondered. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He called Mark and relayed the address. Follow her, Daniel said, his voice strained. I need to know what's going on. On it, Mark replied without hesitation. For the next hour, Daniel paced the house like a caged animal, his mind racing with possibilities. Was Vanessa meeting someone? Was it really an affair? The waiting was excruciating. Finally, Mark called back with an update. She's inside the house. Lights are on, but the curtains are drawn. I saw a man let her in, mid-30s, well-dressed. Could be a colleague or something more. Daniel's stomach churned. He knew the truth was close, too close. He needed to see it for himself. Keep watching, Daniel instructed. I'm heading there now. As he grabbed his keys and headed out the door, a cold sense of inevitability settled over him. The night was far from over, and whatever unfolded next would change his life forever. The drive to the address was a blur. Daniel's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Every worst-case scenario played in his mind like a reel on loop. He told himself to stay calm, to focus, but it was nearly impossible. He had spent days imagining this moment, fearing it, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure how he'd handle it. When he arrived, he parked a few houses away and cut the engine. The street was quiet, lined with towering oaks that cast long shadows under the dim streetlights. Mark's car was parked on the opposite side of the street, and the investigator waved discreetly as Daniel approached. She's still inside, Mark said in a low voice. No movement near the front entrance since she arrived. Daniel nodded, his jaw clenched. You said there was a man? Yeah. Early 30s, maybe mid-30s. He answered the door when she got here, and they went inside together. No sign of anyone else. Daniel's heart pounded. A man. He didn't know why it stung so much. After all, wasn't this what he had feared all along? Yet hearing it confirmed made the suspicion feel more real, more visceral. Do you have a camera on the house? Daniel asked. Yep. I've got a good angle on the front, Mark replied, showing him a live feed on his phone. The view captured the front door and part of the living room window, though the curtains blocked any clear view inside. If anything happens, we'll see it. But Daniel wasn't interested in waiting anymore. He needed to act. Standing there on the sidewalk, he felt like a man on the edge of a cliff. One wrong step and he'd fall into the abyss of betrayal, but he couldn't just stand still. He had to know the truth, no matter how ugly it was. I need to get closer, Daniel said. I'll go around back. Mark hesitated. Are you sure that's a good idea? You don't want to get caught. They won't see me, Daniel assured him. I just want a better look. Daniel crept along the side of the house, keeping to the shadows. His heart thumped in his ears as he approached a set of French doors at the back. The curtains here were only partially drawn, leaving a small gap through which he could see inside. He crouched low, carefully peeking through the glass. There she was. Vanessa sat on a couch in the living room, her posture relaxed in a way that Daniel hadn't seen in months. She was smiling, a warm, genuine smile that he thought had disappeared from their marriage. And sitting beside her, far too close for comfort, was the man Mark had described. The man leaned in, saying something that made Vanessa laugh softly. She reached out and touched his arm in a familiar, almost intimate gesture. Daniel felt a wave of nausea roll over him. He wanted to burst through the doors, to demand answers, but he forced himself to stay still. He needed more than a confrontation fueled by anger. He needed undeniable proof. He pulled out his phone and snapped a few photos through the gap in the curtains. The images weren't perfect, but they showed enough: Vanessa's smile, her hand on the man's arm, their shared closeness. It was evidence. Cold, damning evidence. Daniel circled back to the front of the house, his mind racing. Mark was waiting for him near the car, his expression tense. Well? Mark asked. Did you see anything? Daniel nodded stiffly. She's with him. Laughing. Touching his arm. They're comfortable with each other. Mark sighed. I'm sorry, man. Do you want me to keep monitoring, or… No, Daniel interrupted. I've seen enough. Let's head back. They drove in silence, the weight of what Daniel had witnessed pressing down on him like a heavy stone. He stared out the window, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of anger, pain, and disbelief. Vanessa had been distant for months, but seeing her so at ease with another man was a knife to the gut. He thought about the nights he had waited up for her, the excuses she had made, the lies she had told. Now there were no more doubts. Back at home, Daniel sat in the darkened living room, scrolling through the photos he had taken. Each image brought a fresh wave of hurt. He tried to rationalize it, to tell himself that maybe it wasn't as bad as it seemed. Maybe it was just a friend, an innocent encounter. But deep down, he knew better. People didn't look at friends the way Vanessa had looked at that man. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Mark. "Let me know how you want to proceed. I've got everything documented if you decide to take legal action." Daniel didn't reply immediately. Legal action. The words felt heavy, final. Was that where this was headed? A divorce? A messy court battle that would rip their lives apart? He didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was certain: Vanessa owed him the truth. He wouldn't let her keep lying to him, not anymore. Daniel stood and walked upstairs to the master bedroom. The bed felt colder than ever, an empty expanse of betrayal and broken trust. He lay awake for hours, the images of Vanessa and the man replaying in his mind. Tomorrow, he would confront her. And tomorrow, everything would change. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, as though the weather had conspired to match Daniel's mood. He hadn't slept at all. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Vanessa smiling at that man, heard the soft sound of her laughter echoing in his mind. It was maddening, like a recurring nightmare he couldn't escape. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His phone lay beside him, the photos from the night before still open on the screen. He had thought about deleting them more than once, but something in him wouldn't allow it. They were a reminder of what he had seen with his own eyes, a truth he could no longer deny. Footsteps echoed from the stairs. Vanessa appeared in the doorway, looking fresh and composed as if the previous night had been completely normal. She wore a casual blouse and jeans, her hair neatly pulled back into a ponytail. When she saw Daniel at the table, she hesitated for a moment before offering a tentative smile. "Morning," she said, her voice light but guarded. "Morning," Daniel replied evenly, his eyes meeting hers. He wondered if she could sense the shift in him, the simmering tension beneath his calm exterior. "Did you sleep okay?" Vanessa asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. She avoided looking directly at him, her movements a little too deliberate. "No," Daniel said flatly. "Couldn't sleep." "You?" She paused for a beat, then nodded. "Yeah, I slept fine." Daniel's jaw tightened. The lies came so easily to her now. He wondered how many other lies she had told him over the past few months. He wanted to confront her right then and there, to lay everything on the table and demand answers, but he held back. Timing was crucial. He needed her to feel comfortable, to let her guard down before he made his move. "I was thinking we could spend some time together today," Daniel said after a moment. "Maybe go for a drive, grab lunch somewhere." Vanessa seemed surprised by the suggestion. "Oh, that sounds nice. I actually have some errands to run later, but maybe in the afternoon?" "Errands?" Daniel repeated, his voice laced with quiet skepticism. "What kind of errands?" Vanessa hesitated again, just long enough to make him suspicious. "Just a few things for work. I need to pick up supplies for an event I'm planning." Daniel nodded slowly. Another excuse. He wondered if the man from last night was part of today's errands. Would she meet him again, under the same veil of deception? "All right," Daniel said, keeping his tone neutral. "Afternoon works for me." Vanessa gave him a tight smile. "Great. I'll be back by 2, maybe earlier." She sipped her coffee and glanced at the clock, clearly eager to leave. Daniel watched her closely, noting the subtle tension in her posture. She was hiding something, he could feel it. But today, he wouldn't let her slip away so easily. After Vanessa left, Daniel contacted Mark. He explained the situation and asked for an update on the surveillance. "I'll tail her," Mark assured him. If she meets that guy again, I'll let you know right away. Good, Daniel said. This ends today. I'm done playing this game. He spent the next few hours pacing the house, alternating between fury and anxiety. Part of him wanted to give Vanessa the benefit of the doubt, to believe there was an innocent explanation for everything. But the images from the previous night refused to let him cling to that hope. Shortly after noon, Mark called with an update. She's on the move, Mark said. Headed toward the same area as last night. Looks like she's going back to that house. Daniel's pulse quickened. Is the man there? Not yet, Mark replied. But I'll keep an eye on things. Thanks, Daniel muttered. He hung up and stared out the window, his mind racing. He had two choices: wait for more evidence or confront her now. Waiting felt like torture, but he needed to be sure. This confrontation had to be definitive, undeniable. Another hour passed in agonizing silence. Daniel's phone buzzed again. She's inside, Mark reported. And the man just arrived. Same guy as last night. Daniel clenched his fist, rage surging through him like wildfire. This was it. The truth was out in the open now, no more room for doubt. Stay there, Daniel said. I'm on my way. The drive to the house was eerily calm. Daniel felt a strange detachment, as though he were watching himself from a distance. His emotions were still there, anger, betrayal, sadness, but they were buried under a cold, calculating resolve. He had played the waiting game long enough. When he arrived, he parked a short distance from the house and spotted Mark's car nearby. The investigator gave him a nod but didn't get out. Daniel appreciated the silent support. This was something he had to do on his own. He approached the front door, his heart pounding harder with each step. He could hear faint voices inside, laughter, conversation, mocking echoes of the life he thought he had shared with Vanessa. His hand hovered over the doorbell for a moment before he pressed it firmly. The sound of the doorbell reverberated inside the house. The voices went silent. A few seconds later, the door opened, and there she was, Vanessa, her eyes widening in shock as she saw him standing there. Daniel? She whispered, her voice laced with disbelief. Daniel's gaze hardened. We need to talk. Behind her, the man appeared, looking equally stunned. Daniel's eyes met his, and the tension in the air became suffocating. The confrontation had begun. Vanessa stood frozen in the doorway, her hand gripping the frame as though it could anchor her in place. Her eyes darted between Daniel and the man behind her, panic flickering across her face. For a few long seconds, none of them spoke. The air was thick with tension, each moment stretching painfully in silence. Daniel, Vanessa finally said, forcing a nervous smile. What are you doing here? Daniel crossed his arms, his expression cold and unreadable. I could ask you the same thing. I thought you were running errands. Vanessa blinked rapidly, struggling to find an answer. I was. I just stopped by here to see a friend. A friend, Daniel repeated, his voice low and dangerous. This friend? The man stepped forward cautiously, his posture stiff. He was tall, with dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He had the look of someone used to getting his way, a man who thought he was untouchable until now. Look, I don't know what's going on here, the man said, his tone defensive. But maybe we should all just calm down. Daniel's gaze snapped to him, his jaw tightening. You don't get to tell me to calm down. I'm talking to my wife. The man hesitated, glancing at Vanessa as if silently asking for guidance. Vanessa swallowed hard, her face paling. Daniel, please, she said quietly. Can we talk about this somewhere else? In private? Private? Daniel echoed with a bitter laugh. You want privacy now? After everything? No, Vanessa. We're doing this right here. No more secrets. Her eyes widened in fear. Secrets? I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, come on! Daniel snapped, his voice rising. Don't insult my intelligence. I know what's going on. I've seen the evidence. I saw you with him last night, laughing, touching him like he's the one you care about. Vanessa's mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked as though she had been slapped. I followed you, Daniel continued, his voice shaking with anger. I saw you come here. I've got photos, videos, everything. So don't stand there and lie to my face. The color drained from Vanessa's face. The man behind her shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing that this was more than just a misunderstanding. Vanessa, the man said cautiously, maybe you should explain. Don't, Daniel interrupted, pointing a finger at him. Don't speak. You don't get to explain anything. The man raised his hands in a gesture of surrender and took a step back, wisely choosing to stay silent. Vanessa looked like she was on the verge of tears. Daniel, please. I can explain. It's not what you think. Then what is it, huh? Daniel demanded, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. Tell me. Make me understand why you've been sneaking around, lying to me. Why you've been spending your nights here with him instead of with your family. Tears welled in Vanessa's eyes, but Daniel didn't feel any sympathy. He had spent too many sleepless nights agonizing over her lies. He wasn't going to let her cry her way out of this. Daniel, Vanessa hesitated, struggling to find the right words. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never wanted to hurt you. Daniel scoffed. Well, congratulations. You did. The three of them stood in tense silence once more. Daniel could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had waited for this confrontation, imagined it 100 different ways, but now that it was happening, he felt raw and exposed. The truth was out in the open, but it didn't bring the closure he had hoped for. Instead, it left him feeling hollow. I gave you everything, Daniel said quietly, his voice trembling. I trusted you. And you threw it all away. Why? Vanessa wiped at her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. I was lonely, Daniel. You've been so distant lately, always working, always distracted. I felt invisible. And when I met Alex? Alex, Daniel repeated, glaring at the man. So now he has a name. Vanessa flinched. When I met him, it wasn't supposed to mean anything. It just happened. I didn't plan for this, Daniel. I was lost, and I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. A mistake? Daniel said bitterly. Mistakes are one-time things, Vanessa. This has been going on for months. That's not a mistake, that's a choice. She nodded slowly, unable to refute his words. You're right. I made choices. Bad ones. And I hate myself for it. Daniel shook his head, the weight of her confession pressing down on him. I thought we were stronger than this. I thought you loved me. I do love you. Vanessa insisted, stepping closer to him. I never stopped. I lost my way. Love doesn't look like this, Daniel said coldly, stepping back to avoid her touch. You betrayed me, Vanessa. You betrayed us. Alex shifted awkwardly in the background, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Daniel ignored him, focusing solely on Vanessa. This moment wasn't about the other man, it was about the broken promises between husband and wife. So what now? Vanessa asked softly, tears streaming down her face. Are you going to leave? Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't know the answer yet. Everything he thought he knew had been shattered in the span of a single night. He needed time to think, to figure out what came next. I don't know, he admitted. But I can't stay here right now. I need space. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away, leaving Vanessa and Alex standing in stunned silence on the doorstep. The truth was out, and there was no going back. Daniel drove aimlessly for what felt like hours. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white, but he barely noticed. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts: rage, disbelief, sorrow. The images from earlier at the house played on a loop in his head: Vanessa's tears, her feeble excuses, the other man standing awkwardly behind her. Alex. Even the name infuriated him. It made everything more real. This wasn't just a vague suspicion or paranoia anymore. His wife, the woman he had built a life with, had betrayed him, and there was another man who had taken his place in ways Daniel couldn't bear to think about. The city streets blurred around him as he replayed her words. I was lonely. I made a mistake. I lost my way. Excuses? That's all they were. Maybe there had been problems in their marriage, sure, he'd been busy with work, distracted at times, but didn't every couple face challenges? Did that give her the right to lie to him? To seek comfort in another man's arms? Daniel shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. The anger threatened to consume him entirely, but he couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. He needed to think clearly. He needed a plan. Eventually, he found himself parked at a quiet overlook on the outskirts of town. The city skyline stretched out before him, glittering in the distance like a world that didn't care about his pain. He leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes, letting the silence wash over him. But the silence was short-lived. His phone buzzed on the dashboard. He glanced at the screen. Vanessa's name flashed across it. For a moment, he considered ignoring the call. He didn't want to hear her voice, didn't want to listen to more half-hearted apologies or desperate pleas for forgiveness. But something compelled him to answer. Maybe he needed to hear it for himself, to know exactly where they stood. He took a deep breath and tapped the screen. What do you want, Vanessa? There was a pause on the other end before she spoke. Her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. Daniel. I just wanted to see if you're okay. Okay? He repeated, his voice laced with bitter disbelief. You really think I'm okay after what happened today? I know you're not, she said softly. I didn't want you to feel like you were alone. Daniel laughed bitterly. Alone? That's funny coming from you. You're the one who made me feel alone in this marriage. You're the one who found someone else. Please don't do this. Vanessa pleaded. I know I hurt you. I know I broke your trust. But I still love you, Daniel. I don't want to lose you. Maybe you should have thought about that before you started sneaking around. He shot back. Love isn't just a word, Vanessa. It's supposed to mean something. There was another long silence. He could hear her breathing on the other end, the sound trembling as if she were trying to hold back tears. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, she said finally. But I want to make things right. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll end it with Alex. I'll go to therapy, counseling, whatever you want. Just, please don't give up on us. Daniel closed his eyes, conflicted. Part of him wanted to hang up, to shut her out and never speak to her again. But another part, the part that still loved her, despite everything, wasn't ready to let go. He hated that part of himself. He hated that he still cared. I need time, he said quietly. I can't make any decisions right now. I need space. I understand, Vanessa whispered. Take all the time you need. Just know that I'll be here, waiting. I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I'm sorry. Daniel didn't respond. He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. His heart felt heavy, like it was being crushed under the weight of his emotions. He had never felt so lost, so torn between anger and longing. The following days passed in a haze. Daniel took time off work, unable to focus on anything other than the wreckage of his marriage. He spent hours driving through the countryside, seeking solace in isolation. He ignored most calls and messages, except for brief check-ins from Mark and Sarah, his lawyer. Sarah had been one of his first calls after the confrontation. He needed to know his options, what a divorce would look like, how it would affect their assets and custody arrangements if they had children in the future. Sarah had listened patiently and offered sound advice, but the conversation left Daniel feeling even more overwhelmed. I don't know if I'm ready for that, he admitted during their call. Divorce isn't something you have to rush into, Sarah had reassured him. Take your time. Figure out what you want. If reconciliation is on the table, there are steps you can take. But if not, you'll need to start preparing. Now, those words echoed in his mind as he sat in his living room, surrounded by memories of a life that suddenly felt hollow. The walls that had once been filled with warmth and laughter now felt suffocating, like a prison of broken dreams. What did he want? Could he ever trust Vanessa again? Or was the damage too great to repair? Daniel didn't have the answers yet. But he knew one thing for certain: the path forward would be anything but easy. Daniel tried to re-establish some sense of normalcy in the following days, though it felt like moving through quicksand. The routine of daily life, grocery shopping, paying bills, answering emails, felt surreal, as if he were going through the motions without really being present. The wound from Vanessa's betrayal was still fresh, throbbing like a dull ache that refused to subside. Vanessa, meanwhile, tried to keep her distance. She didn't call or text often, though she sent a few short messages expressing her hope that they could talk when he was ready. Daniel didn't reply. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say. He was caught in a limbo between anger and the faint whisper of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be salvaged. But that hope was tenuous, and every time he thought about her with Alex, it threatened to vanish entirely. One morning, Daniel met with Mark at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. The investigator had continued monitoring Vanessa's activities in the days since the confrontation, though Daniel wasn't sure why he had asked for it. Maybe it was a matter of control, an attempt to gather every piece of information he could, as if understanding the full picture might ease the pain. "She hasn't met with Alex since that day," Mark reported as they sat in a booth near the window. "She's been going about her usual routine, work, errands, and back home. Nothing suspicious." Daniel nodded slowly, stirring his coffee without drinking it. "Maybe she really did end it." "Maybe," Mark agreed. "But that doesn't mean everything's fine. Trust is a tricky thing to rebuild." "I know," Daniel muttered. "It feels like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. Like I can't trust anything she says or does anymore." "That's normal," Mark said. "Betrayal like this messes with your head. You're always going to be on high alert, at least for a while. The question is, do you want to rebuild that trust, or are you done?" Daniel sighed, staring out the window at the empty parking lot. He didn't have an answer. Every fiber of his being told him to walk away, to sever ties and start over. But another part of him, the part that remembered the good times, the woman he had fallen in love with, wasn't ready to let go. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "I need more time." Mark nodded understandingly. "Take all the time you need. Just remember, whatever decision you make, it's gotta be for you. Not out of guilt or obligation." Later that afternoon, Daniel received an unexpected call from Sarah. "We need to talk," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Vanessa contacted me. She wants to arrange a meeting between the two of you, with me as a mediator." Daniel frowned. "A mediator? What does she want?" "She says she wants to come clean about everything and figure out where you both stand," Sarah explained. "I think she's trying to show you that she's serious about making things right." Daniel felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Part of him bristled at the idea of sitting in a room with Vanessa, listening to her excuses and apologies. But another part of him, a quieter, more rational part, acknowledged that it might be necessary. If there was any hope of moving forward, he needed to hear her out. "All right," he said after a long pause. "Set it up." The meeting took place 2 days later at Sarah's office. Daniel arrived early, his stomach churning with nerves. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to let Vanessa manipulate him. This time, he held the power. He had the evidence, the upper hand, and the right to demand answers. Vanessa arrived shortly after, dressed simply in a blouse and slacks. She looked exhausted, as though she hadn't slept much since their last encounter. She offered a tentative smile as she entered the conference room, but Daniel didn't return it. Sarah greeted them both and motioned for them to sit. "All right," she began, her tone professional. "Let's start with the facts. Vanessa, you requested this meeting. What do you want to say to Daniel?" Vanessa took a deep breath, folding her hands on the table in front of her. "Daniel, I'm sorry. For everything. I know I hurt you in ways that might never heal. And I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want you to know that I ended things with Alex. Completely. I'm not going to see him again. Daniel's expression remained cold. You think that changes anything? No, she said quickly. I know it doesn't. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm serious. I'll go to counseling. I'll be honest about everything from now on. I don't want to lose you. You already lost me the moment you lied to me, Daniel said quietly. How do you expect me to trust you again after what you did? Vanessa swallowed hard, tears brimming in her eyes. I don't expect you to trust me right away. I know I have to earn it back. But I'm willing to put in the work, if you'll give me a chance. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, his mind racing. The anger and betrayal were still there, simmering beneath the surface. But he also saw something else, genuine remorse. He couldn't tell if it was enough, but it was something. Fine, he said finally. We'll try counseling. But I'm not making any promises. If you mess up again, it's over. Vanessa nodded, her tears spilling over. Thank you. I'll do everything I can to make things right. Sarah gave a small nod of approval. This is a good first step. Trust is rebuilt slowly, one day at a time. Let's focus on what comes next. Daniel sat back in his chair, exhaustion washing over him. He wasn't sure if he was making the right decision, but for now, it was the only one he could live with. In the weeks following their meeting, Daniel and Vanessa began attending couples counseling. The sessions were awkward and emotionally draining at first, filled with long silences and tense exchanges. It was like peeling away layers of scar tissue, each conversation exposing old wounds and fresh pain. Their counselor, Dr. Patel, was a calm and patient woman who guided them through difficult topics with care. She often started sessions by asking both of them to express how they were feeling. Daniel, Dr. Patel would say, how would you describe your emotions today? Conflicted, Daniel would reply, without hesitation. Part of me wants to move on, to try and make this work. But another part of me is still angry. I don't know how to let that go. Vanessa would listen silently, her eyes downcast, before it was her turn. I feel ashamed, she admitted in one session. I hate what I did. I hate that I hurt you. I wake up every day wishing I could take it back. Dr. Patel nodded thoughtfully. It's natural to feel anger and shame in a situation like this. But the goal of these sessions is to move toward understanding. You both have to decide if rebuilding trust is what you truly want. Daniel wasn't sure how to answer that question yet. The pain was still fresh, but the fact that he was in these sessions at all meant he wasn't ready to walk away completely. He wanted to believe that healing was possible, even if it felt out of reach. Outside of counseling, life slowly began to stabilize. Vanessa made a noticeable effort to rebuild trust. She was transparent about her whereabouts, sending updates throughout the day and inviting Daniel to join her for outings whenever possible. She also stopped using her phone obsessively, leaving it out in the open as if to prove she had nothing to hide. But for Daniel, suspicion lingered like a shadow. Every time her phone buzzed with a notification, he felt a spike of anxiety. He couldn't help but wonder if there were still secrets she wasn't telling him. It was an exhausting way to live, constantly questioning her every move. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from Mark. Thought you'd want to know, no contact between Vanessa and Alex. Looks like she's staying true to her word. Daniel stared at the message for a moment before deleting it. He had told Mark to continue monitoring Vanessa for a while, just to be sure. Now he felt guilty for doing so, even though the report brought a small sense of relief. Vanessa noticed his distraction and paused the movie. Everything okay? Yeah, Daniel said quickly, forcing a smile. Just a message from work. She studied him for a moment, as if sensing there was more to the story, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she reached for his hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. I know it's hard to trust me right now, she said softly. But I hope you know that I'm trying. I'll keep trying for as long as it takes. Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. He wanted to believe her, but trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. It would take time and consistency. I know you're trying, he admitted. And I appreciate that. But it's going to take a while for me to feel normal again. If that ever happens. I understand, Vanessa whispered. I'm not going anywhere. We'll get through this. As the days passed, Daniel began to notice subtle changes in his own mindset. The raw anger he had carried for weeks started to fade, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. He found himself looking forward to counseling sessions, where he and Vanessa could express their fears and frustrations in a safe space. Slowly, they began to communicate more openly. One afternoon, Dr. Patel gave them an exercise designed to foster connection. They were instructed to write letters to each other, expressing their feelings without interruption or judgment. The goal was to articulate things that were difficult to say out loud. Daniel spent hours agonizing over his letter. What did he want to say? That he still loved her, despite everything? That he missed the woman she used to be, the woman who had laughed with him on lazy Sunday mornings and supported him through life's challenges? Or did he want to focus on his pain, on the betrayal that had shattered his trust? In the end, he wrote both. During their next session, they exchanged letters. Vanessa's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded Daniel's letter and began reading. Tears welled in her eyes as she absorbed his words, the heartbreak, the anger, but also the lingering hope for reconciliation. I didn't know you still felt this way, she whispered, her voice cracking. I thought I'd destroyed everything. You almost did, Daniel said softly. But I'm still here. I'm giving us a chance because I want to believe that things can get better. Vanessa nodded, wiping her eyes. They will. I'll prove it to you. Dr. Patel smiled gently. This is a good step. You're both acknowledging the pain while also committing to growth. That's the foundation of healing. For the first time in months, Daniel felt a glimmer of hope. The path ahead was still uncertain, but it no longer seemed insurmountable. They were making progress, however slow and fragile it might be. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Daniel found himself reaching for Vanessa's hand. She squeezed it gently, a silent promise passing between them. The road to recovery was long, but perhaps it was a road worth traveling. For now, they were taking it one step at a time. Weeks turned into months. Counseling sessions continued, but the emotional wounds still lingered beneath the surface. Some days felt almost normal, like the version of their marriage that had existed before the affair. On other days, the weight of betrayal resurfaced with a vengeance, leaving Daniel distant and guarded. Vanessa remained patient, never pushing him too hard. She knew the damage she had caused couldn't be repaired overnight. Every small gesture, every open conversation and act of honesty, was part of her effort to rebuild what she had broken. But forgiveness was a tricky thing. Daniel wasn't sure he believed in it anymore. Could you truly forgive someone who had shattered your trust? Or did forgiveness mean learning to live with the pain without letting it define you? The test came on an ordinary Wednesday evening. Daniel had just finished a late meeting at work when his phone buzzed with a call from Vanessa. He answered, his voice tired but steady. Hey, he said. What's up? I'm sorry to bother you, she said hesitantly. But Alex showed up today. Daniel froze, his mind going blank for a moment. What did you just say? Alex, Vanessa repeated quietly. He came to my office. I didn't know he was coming, and I didn't let him stay long. But I thought you should know. Anger surged through Daniel like a tidal wave. Why the hell would he come to see you? I thought you ended things. I did, Vanessa said quickly. I haven't had any contact with him since the day you confronted us. He just showed up out of nowhere, saying he wanted to talk. And did you talk to him? Daniel demanded, his voice hardening. For a few minutes, Vanessa admitted. I told him I couldn't see him anymore and that he needed to leave. I made it clear that there's nothing between us. I swear, Daniel. Daniel clenched his jaw, pacing in his office. He hated that this man still had the power to disrupt their lives. The thought of Alex showing up uninvited, trying to worm his way back in, made Daniel's blood boil. "Did you report him to security?" Daniel asked. "No," Vanessa replied, sounding ashamed. "I didn't want to make a scene. I just wanted him gone." Daniel exhaled sharply. He knew he needed to stay calm, but it wasn't easy. Trust was a fragile thing, and this incident felt like a test, a reminder of how easily everything could unravel again. "I appreciate you telling me," he said after a long pause. "But if he comes near you again, I want you to call security. I don't care if it causes a scene. He doesn't get to invade our lives like this." "I understand," Vanessa said softly. "I'll do that." Daniel ended the call and sat down heavily in his chair. His hands trembled with residual anger. He had been making progress, slowly learning to trust again, but this had shaken him. The scars of the past weren't so easily healed. That night, Vanessa greeted him at the door with a mixture of caution and concern. She had clearly been dreading his reaction, but Daniel wasn't in the mood for another confrontation. He had spent the drive home calming himself, repeating the words of their counselor in his mind. Communication. Transparency. Trust is rebuilt one choice at a time. "I'm not mad at you," Daniel said quietly as he stepped inside. "But I need to know that you're serious about cutting him out completely. I can't do this if there are any more surprises." "There won't be," Vanessa promised. "I blocked his number and told my coworkers not to let him into the building. I don't want him in our lives any more than you do." Daniel studied her face, searching for any sign of deception. All he saw was sincerity and fear, the fear of losing him for good. Slowly he nodded. "Okay," he said. "But this is your responsibility now. If he crosses a line again, it's on you to deal with it." Vanessa nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I won't let you down." As the days passed, the incident faded into the background, though it left a lingering tension between them. Daniel kept his guard up, wary of any sign that Alex might try to reinsert himself into their lives. But Vanessa kept her word. She doubled down on transparency, keeping Daniel informed of her whereabouts and cutting off any remaining ties to her former lover. For the first time in a long while, Daniel began to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. Maybe it was about choosing to move forward, even when the scars remained. During their next counseling session, Dr. Patel brought up the topic of forgiveness. "Forgiveness is often misunderstood," she said. "It doesn't mean forgetting what happened or excusing the behavior. It's a decision to release the hold that pain and resentment have on you. It's about freeing yourself, not the other person." Daniel thought about those words long after the session ended. Could he release the hold that anger had on him? Could he find a way to rebuild his life without being defined by the betrayal? That night, he and Vanessa sat on the back porch, watching the stars. The air was cool and peaceful, a stark contrast to the storm that had dominated their lives for so long. "I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness," Daniel said quietly. "It's not easy. I don't know if I'm ready to say I've forgiven you. But I'm trying." Vanessa reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "That's all I can ask for. I'll keep trying too." They sat in silence for a while, their hands intertwined. The path ahead was still uncertain, but they were walking it together, step by cautious step. For now, that was enough. Spring arrived quietly, bringing with it a sense of renewal that Daniel hadn't expected. The trees bloomed in vibrant shades of green, and the days grew longer, filled with golden sunlight. Slowly but surely, life began to feel less like a battleground and more like something he could find joy in again. Daniel and Vanessa continued their counseling sessions, but they were less tense now, more focused on building a future rather than rehashing the past. Trust wasn't fully restored, but it was growing, one small act of honesty at a time. Vanessa was consistent in her efforts to show Daniel that she was committed to rebuilding their relationship. One Saturday morning, Vanessa suggested they spend the day at a nearby lake, a place they hadn't visited since early in their marriage. It had been one of their favorite spots, a peaceful retreat from the demands of work and life. Daniel hesitated at first, but he eventually agreed. He wanted to see if they could reclaim some of the good memories they had lost. The lake shimmered under the sunlight, the water calm and inviting. They set up a picnic on a grassy hill overlooking the shoreline. Daniel watched Vanessa as she spread out the blanket, her face relaxed and content. It was a rare sight, one he hadn't seen in what felt like forever. This was a good idea, he admitted as he sat beside her. I forgot how peaceful it is here. Vanessa smiled softly. I was hoping you'd say that. We used to come here all the time. Yeah, Daniel said, his gaze drifting to the water. Feels like a lifetime ago. For me too, Vanessa murmured. She hesitated for a moment, then added, but maybe we can start making new memories. Better ones. Daniel glanced at her, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes. It reminded him of the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman who had once been his closest friend. He didn't know if they could ever fully return to what they had been before the affair, but he was beginning to believe that they could create something new. Maybe, he said quietly. It won't be easy. But I think it's worth trying. Vanessa's smile widened, a mix of relief and gratitude in her expression. I think so too. As they spent the day together, Daniel felt some of the tension in his chest begin to ease. They laughed over old memories, reminiscing about their early days of dating and the adventures they had shared. For the first time in months, he wasn't constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. He was simply present, enjoying the moment. Later that afternoon, they rented a paddleboat and glided across the lake. The gentle rocking of the boat and the sound of water lapping against the sides created a soothing rhythm. Vanessa leaned back, tilting her face toward the sun. Remember when we tried this on our honeymoon? She asked with a grin. We almost capsized because you thought it'd be fun to rock the boat. Daniel chuckled. Hey, you were the one who dared me to do it. I was just living up to the challenge. Oh, sure. Blame me, Vanessa teased, splashing a bit of water in his direction. They fell into an easy rhythm of playful banter, a dynamic they hadn't shared in a long time. It felt good, natural. Daniel realized that for the first time in a while, he wasn't consumed by thoughts of betrayal. He was letting himself feel something lighter, something closer to hope. That night, back at home, they sat together on the couch. The house, which had once felt suffocating and empty, now seemed a little warmer. Daniel poured them each a glass of wine, and they clinked glasses in a quiet toast. To moving forward, Vanessa said softly. To moving forward, Daniel echoed. They sipped their wine, the silence between them comfortable for once. Daniel knew they still had a long road ahead. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, and painful memories that might resurface. But they were learning how to navigate those moments together. As the evening wore on, Vanessa rested her head on Daniel's shoulder. He didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, he let himself relax, savoring the simple intimacy of the moment. Trust was fragile, but it was slowly being rebuilt, brick by brick. I'm proud of us, Vanessa whispered. For not giving up. Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames in the fireplace. Yeah. Me too. In the weeks that followed, Daniel continued to work on himself. He started journaling, something Dr. Patel had recommended to help him process his emotions. It became a nightly ritual, a way to clear his mind and reflect on the progress they were making. Writing allowed him to confront the pain without being consumed by it. Vanessa also took steps to heal and grow. She attended individual therapy sessions and focused on rebuilding her sense of self-worth. The affair had been a symptom of deeper issues, and she was determined to address those issues head-on. She didn't want to repeat the mistakes of the past. Their marriage wasn't perfect, far from it. But it was evolving, transforming into something stronger and more resilient. They were learning to be honest with each other, to communicate openly about their fears and desires. Slowly, the walls between them began to crumble. One evening, after a particularly good counseling session, Daniel found himself standing on their back porch, gazing up at the stars. Vanessa joined him, slipping her hand into his. Do you ever wonder what's next? She asked softly. All the time, Daniel replied. But for once, I'm not afraid of it. She smiled, squeezing his hand gently. Neither am I. They stood there together, letting the cool night air wash over them. The scars of their past were still there, but they no longer defined them. They had chosen to fight for their marriage, to rebuild what had been broken. And now, for the first time in a long while, the future felt like something worth looking forward to.